Thank you for plugging into this Family Life News podcast, streaming issues-driven, family-focused news.
This is Faith Under Fire. Each Thursday on Family Life, we give voice to religious battlegrounds in this nation. I'm your host, Tracy Lynn. With us today, Ian Huyett, General Counsel and Director of Policy with Cornerstone. Ian, we live in a topsy-turvy culture. Recently, New York State's governor signed legislation to require that utility employees refer to transgender individuals by their preferred pronoun. It must be confusing for children and young adults to see adults adding to the gender jumble. A New Hampshire teenager is suing his school district after he was allegedly suspended from athletics for saying there are only two genders. So let's talk about what are the rights for students? What are the free speech rights for students? Because I think sometimes when things like this come up, people are like, well, I'm not sure.
Well, students do have somewhat diminished First Amendment rights, but the U.S. Supreme Court has been very clear that students do still have those rights. The court said in Tinker, a famous case from the late 60s, that students do not shed their First Amendment rights at the schoolhouse door. The court also said that in order for a school to prohibit an expression of any particular opinion, it's not enough to show that that opinion is unpopular or upsetting. If the school wants to prohibit a particular opinion, it needs to show that that speech would materially and substantially interfere with school discipline. So that's going to be something a lot more hazardous than just expressing your opinion on a cultural issue like whether there are more than two genders.
Wow. And recently a student in New Hampshire did that. Can you give us a couple of the basics about that case?
Well, what's so remarkable about our case is that our client did not interact with any specific transgender or non-binary student. He was penalized simply for expressing his general opinion that there are only two genders. He stated that on a school bus, and he reiterated that over a text message to another student. That student then apparently copied that text message and gave it to administrators, and the administrators pulled him aside and subjected him to an athletic suspension. So I think we can see that despite the pretty clear precedent from our Supreme Court on students' First Amendment rights, schools do increasingly think that they are arbiters of student opinion and can dictate the content of student speech.
Yeah, and I think it was earlier this year, the Mahanoy city cheerleader in Pennsylvania, she sent a nasty text or Instagram message. She was off school grounds. I don't know if your client was off school grounds, but this girl was off school grounds.
She was for the text messages, and you're exactly right. That case is important for us. The Mahanoy case, what that did basically is add some additional protections on top of Tinker for when students are off school grounds. So in any student speech case, if the school wants to win and be allowed to prohibit a particular opinion, it needs to be able to make that showing that I mentioned of material and substantial interference, or it loses. And then in Mahanoy, what Justice Breyer, writing for the majority, said is on top of that, when a student is off school grounds, there are these additional factors that diminish the school's interest in regulating that speech. For example, that this would give schools too much power to regulate speech if they could regulate speech of students throughout the 24-hour day.
Yeah, wow. Like you said, I think we're just going to see more and more of this. Any words of wisdom that you have for our listeners when it comes to free speech or freedom of religion issues?
Well, I would say one word of wisdom that I think a lot of believers need to hear is that it's a lot easier to stand up and defy these kinds of, unconstitutional impositions than I think people expect it will be. Our client has gotten tremendous support in the community. There's, of course, been hostility, but by and large, people like to see an underdog stand up and defend their rights, especially in a case as egregious as ours. And, displaying boldness is an encouragement to others and will help inspire other people to also stand up and defend those same rights.
That's Ian Huyett with Cornerstone. I'm Tracy Lynn, Family Life News.